And a lot of people who don't look at the price of wind would like you to focus on the price of nuclear. So there's a classic, cognitive dissonance. And so one of my things I wanted to do is I wanted to put a price on wind.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm interviewing a returning guest to the show to examine the economics surrounding Ontario's foray into renewable energy. As is typical in divisive topics such as this, the government has made it very difficult to track down the actual costs of its ideologically driven policies, such as Ontario's 2009 Green Energy Act that announced juicy feed-in tariffs on 20-year contracts for renewable energy linked to inflation to kickstart the green economy. The act was brought in by Liberal Premier Dalton McGuinty and aggressively pursued by his successor in that office, Kathleen Wynne, who was driven out of the office by angry voters with pitchforks in the 2018 election, at which point the Liberals lost official party status. A key element of that loss was her mishandling of the energy transition, the privatization of Hydro One, and the disastrous costs downloaded onto voters. Our guest today is investigating the costs and benefits of renewable energy in Ontario's nuclear and hydro-dominated electrical grid. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app and come visit me on my Facebook group, The Rational View. I'd love to hear from you there. Share your opinions on what you're hearing. We can have a discussion. Please let me know. Edgardo Sepulveda is a telecommunications and electricity economist with the last several years working at his consulting firm in Toronto, Canada. He was born in Chile and has an MA in economics. As part of his civic policy-related engagement, he also writes about inequality, COVID-19, and other issues, including at the Progressive Economics Forum. Edgardo, welcome back to The Rational View.
Thank you, Al. It's been 2-3 years since you first had me on, so very happy to be back.
So you've been working away at a report for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute entitled "The Value of Wind Generation in a Low-Emission Nuclear and Hydro-Dominated Grid: The Case of Ontario, Canada." What were your goals for this work, and do you have any conflicts of interest to declare that might impact your objectivity?
Thank you again for having me on this. The piece is actually in a way similar to the piece that you and I talked about back in, I think it was September 2021, which was that piece on inequality and COVID. And if you recall, and listeners may want to refer back to that was a piece looking at inferential statistical analysis to be able to identify in the noise that was COVID, identify the signal as to whether or not COVID across a series of countries could have an impact or could be driven by economic inequality. That undertook a fairly sophisticated statistical analysis to be able to draw those inferences from the data to be able to provide estimates. I'm doing the same here, except it's for electricity, and it's an issue that both you and I have talked about before, Al, which is about to try to shed some light, some academic light, and some statistical light on this very contentious issues about what should be the ideal generation mix, what are the types of generation resources in the electricity grid that are relatively less valuable, that are relatively more valuable, and how that fits into both a comprehensive view of that value versus a more narrow view when you look at financial costs and benefits. So that's the motivation of the paper. It's to use my skills as an economist, as a quantitative economist in both telecommunications and electricity, to be able to shed some light on the specific value of a wind generation in the Ontario electricity grid. And this is a particularly important issue at this time because, as we've all heard, for those of us who live in Ontario, the government and other policymakers have been focusing on the electricity grid because for the first time in a decade, perhaps 2 decades, there is now a credible expectation that the grid will start to grow again in an absolute sense after about 2 decades of stagnation. If you remember, the first time that you and I had an interview, Al, was about the whole idea of growth, electrification, and the need to, depending on which estimate you're looking at, either double or triple the size of the electricity grid between now and 2050, for example.
Yes. Now, we certainly have been very interested in looking into these things, and the power of the analyses that you do, I think, is very important. And what you're talking about is mainly correlational analysis. And, there's obviously caveats that have to go with any sort of correlation, that correlation does not necessarily equal causation. We're trying to dig out suggestive correlations from the data that try to lead us to a potential conclusion about things, or at least a hypothesis about why things are the way they are. But before we go into that, I just want to clarify, just because there's going to be people that are pro and con on any divisive issue like this. Do you have any conflicts of interest to declare? Are you getting paid by any large corporations to influence this issue? Are you a lobbyist?
No. But the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is a Canadian think tank. And so I am being paid by the think tank to prepare this document.
Okay.
So it is a significant document. Let me talk about it a bit. This document has been a labor of love for about 5-6 months. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute is one of the larger Canadian think tanks. They do a bunch of topics. Energy is one of their core areas of expertise. And so with the energy analysts there, we started talking about what is it that I could contribute to the think tank. And I proposed this, and so I'm happy that it was accepted. It's being internally peer reviewed, like other think tanks do. It is now, as we speak, August 1st, it is now going through final design work. So the version that I sent you was a let's call it an embargoed pre-publication. So your readers are getting a bit of a scoop here.
Awesome.
In terms of that. I'm getting to talk about it. Yeah, I'm getting to talk about it. It's not published yet. We're still going to do a whole promotion, round.
So
but this is part of the this is part of the pre-promotion. And so in your show notes, we'll include the ultimate link to the document that will be published, I'm hoping, literally within a week.
Awesome.
Is what they're saying. It's now with the designer. They're putting their little T's on and I's, and so it's almost ready to go.
So give me your executive summary. What's the report card grade for Ontario's renewable energy transition? And then we can dig into the details.
Well, with A passing, A excellent, F pass the, a failing grade. Within the parameters of what I looked at, it's kind of like an E. And I'm hoping that as a result of the analysis that I've done, I'm hoping that we can turn it around to perhaps an A or a B. But so far, in the study period that I looked at, it has not been valuable at all. I mean, to answer perhaps a rhetorical question, Al, the value of wind generation in a nuclear and hydro dominant grid, it's quite a mouthful, it has not been valuable. And it is not valuable between the years that I looked at, which is 2020 to 2023. Okay. So let me set out the two kinds of aspects that I looked at. And you'll see that the document has two chapters. The first chapter basically is a review of the development of the Ontario grid. Again, for those of you who do not live in Ontario, who you don't follow electricity, Ontario is the most populous province in Canada. It's got about 15 million people. Electricity in Canada, a federal country, is a provincial, mostly provincial jurisdiction, and so all provinces have run quite different grids, and Ontario grid, at least for the last 40 years, has been primarily a dominant, a nuclear and hydro dominant grid. Nuclear and hydro have accounted to, depending on the year, but have averaged in the range of 70 to 80%, which makes Ontario a relatively clean grid in an absolute and a relative sense. And also,
comparing to other jurisdictions in the world, Ontario is very good in terms of its emission intensity. Is what the metric is called.
That's right. That's right. The grid.
Tons of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So
that's right. That's right.
Pollution per unit of deployed energy.
That's right. That's right. And also it's unique in Canada in as much as that it's the only province where we have a nuclear dominant grid. Nuclear also is in New Brunswick and it used to be in Quebec as well. And so from that perspective, where like Ontario is like France, for example, or which has 60-70% nuclear. Ukraine, I think Slovakia is in that ballpark. So the study is looking. It's not a general study. It's a study about wind in Ontario, and so the idea is to try to understand not the grid that could be, because as you know, Al, there's a lot of talk about the grid that could be, and what would work and not work in the grid that could be, but this is about what works in the grid that is. And so that is an important distinction. This is not a modeling exercise of, wish list of what could and could not work in a grid that could or could not exist. This is a statistical analysis of the grid that is, looking at historical data.
Many people have tried to dig into how much the energy transition will cost and the best way to go about it, and even what it's cost Ontario. And surprisingly, it's not easy to find these numbers. So I'm very glad that you've put this together, because it's going to be hopefully a useful tool in the discussion,
fingers
crossed, policy going forward.
Yeah.
I mean, many of the costs have been subsumed into government rebates, and you go
Right.
through this in your report, incentives, and this kind of sleight of hand has allowed the opponents of various forms of energy to go on suggesting that nuclear is a costly option and, wind is good. And then the nuclear supporter is saying, no, nuclear is better and wind is expensive.
Right.
And, but I go back to I think the 2015 Auditor General of Ontario's reports, looked into this, and they said that we had paid Ontarians had paid $37 billion above market value for electricity over eight years, and would be on the hook for 133 billion more by 2032. And then many people would then point fingers. That's nuclear's debt, or that's wind expenses. We have this sprawling network of wind turbines that sprouted up across southern Ontario in the mid noughts. And, how were you able to disentangle all of these things together and attribute costs to wind and other things?
Right. So again, there's two components to the paper. One is looking at that, and I'll certainly talk about that. But that is, let's call that in terms of the level of sophistication. Let's call that accounting level of sophistication. It's not that it's not, and this is not a diss at accounting, but you're working off specific numbers. You're not making stuff up. You're not doing any inferential statistical analysis to make links. That's basically reading of the books. And
so
that's
this is straightforward. There's an answer.
That's right.
You understand it, and you can give us the number.
And that's the numbers. And I've been fortunate to look at a couple of other things that So that's that aspect, and that's the numbers. And the thing is, Al, is that while there's a lot of noise out there from proponents and opponents of the different energy resources, amongst the expert field, which is relatively small, there's no disagreement over these numbers, right? So you've got to differentiate between what is a professional consensus versus what is the social media noise that is out there. And so what I'm trying to do is, I'm not trying to go with the mass perception. I'm trying to influence the expert opinion and the analyst's opinion to be able to provide such data. So I just want to make sure that once you read this paper, for those of you who are interested, this is not an advocacy piece. I'm trying to parse through the data.
And so that's one thing. That's what the Rational View is here for, everybody.
Perfect. We're in sync with that. And then the second part is, let's call it much more, it's not accounting. It's pure econometrics, which is the combination of statistics and economics. I provide formulae and hypotheses, which looks at the actual value of wind, right? Because one of the things that we're all familiar with in Ontario is the famous or infamous Green Energy Act, which was a act that was passed by the Liberal government in 2009, the provincial Liberal government, which was copy pasted, inspired by the German legislation, the green energy legislation, and it did two things that really poisoned the discussion. It did two things. It did one. It provided the right of provincial government to override local decision making with respect to the siting of wind in Ontario. So if you were a municipality in Ontario and you passed the resolution, for example, and of which there's 155 such resolutions, Al, last time I counted, wind concerns Ontario. And that's like 155 out of maybe 400 municipalities in Ontario. So more or less half the municipalities in Ontario have passed such wind is not welcome here. But regardless of that opposition from the local level, the Green Energy Act allowed the provincial government to override those objections, and basically, as the opponent said, is ram these wind turbines down our throats, even though they were not welcomed. So that's one thing that the Green Energy Act is done, because this is typical of many of, let's call it, federal, provincial, local, jurisdictional issues that we're seeing around the world about siting, right? And it pits the we need to transition versus not in my backyard.
Right.
And who has ultimate decision-making power on that? Is it at the federal level? Is it at the provincial level? Is it the municipal level? And so that was one of the driving political forces in Ontario that you and I have talked about before, that
Indeed.
basically in 2018 was the main reason why the Liberal government was booted out of provincial government. Because of their promotion of the Green Energy Act, not only in terms of the dollar amount, but also in terms of the political economy associated with siting of these wind turbines and the corresponding transmission infrastructure.
Okay, so can you give us some numbers here? Let's ground this analysis. Where did you arrive at the cost of the Green Energy Act and all of this green energy transition?
So one of the interesting things that occurred was that the government, through its different agencies, in 2015 stopped in their annual. So ISO, the Independent Electricity Systems Operator, which is the grid operator in Ontario, had traditionally issued, as part of their annual outlook, which is something they do once a year, had traditionally provided historical data, and it traditionally provided historical cost data. In 2015, they stopped doing that for good reason, because costs were just blowing up. For those of you who are not familiar with the process here, Ontario saw unprecedented increases in electricity rates from about 2009 to about 2017, literally doubling of the generation component. And that created a political crisis and a political backlash, and ultimately led to the political defeat of the Green Energy Act as a result of 2018 election. And as we know, the very first thing that the incoming government did was repeal the Green Energy Act, right? And so they did that. They promised that would be the first part. So in that context of a highly, and people don't like inflation, by the way. I mean, in 2024, everyone knows about inflation, but in Ontario, both consumers and companies were seeing inflation at a much, much higher rate on their electricity bills, right? And so people were up in arms. And one of the results of that was that the government believed that it was necessary to introduce very significant government subsidies to lower their prices and lower the political tension associated with higher prices. So anyway, that's the upshot. How did I get the data? Well, this particular piece that I put up is a report that was put up by the Market Surveillance Panel by the Ontario Energy Board in December 2023. They put out the first report in 8 years that set out what the costs of the major components of the electricity system in Ontario have been historically since 2019, and it had it all the way to 2023.
Okay.
This report went totally under the wire, but this is the official numbers where you can understand is where did the underlying costs increase? Was it mostly generation or transmission, or was it mostly transmission or distribution, or was it generation? And from those costs, you could calculate the contribution of each of the generation resources to the overall increases. The punchline is this. The punchline is that between 2009 and 2022, in real dollars, so those are inflation-adjusted dollars, we see an increase in system costs, which is the entire cost of the system, from about 16 billion a year to about 22 billion a year. So in real terms, there was an increase of about $5.4 billion. I was able to calculate that of that increase, the increase associated with wind, which was $2 billion. So wind was responsible for, let's put the number here, make sure I got it. Wind was responsible for 44% of the increase in the generation component.
Okay.
Over those years from 2009 to 2022, and was responsible for 37% of the overall system costs. So even though wind is only contributes to about 9% of total generation, it accounts for 44% of the increase in real generation costs from 2009 to 2022.
Wow. Okay. So that's a significant mismatch.
That's a very significant mismatch.
Not
just
getting
to give you
value for money there.
That's right. So you're not getting value for money there. Just to give you a sense, if it contributes to 9% of generation and has a cost of 2.2, again, that's the cost. That's not the change in cost, 2.2 billion. For example, nuclear has a cost of 7.3 billion, but it accounts for 51% of the generation. And so there's a mismatch. There's wind costs, costs basically double what electricity does. What nuclear does. So there's a mismatch between its contribution in terms of actual megawatt hours and its cost.
So this is all scaled to the unit of power, right?
That's right.
These
it's
are
all
scaled costs per megawatt hour.
Right.
Wind is twice as expensive as nuclear. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
And does this take into account how did you handle, like, I know people would bring up the stranded debt when hydro was sold, right, and allocate that to nuclear. Is that enter into this at all?
These are numbers directly from the market surveillance panel, and so these are actual costs. The stranded debt was paid off well before the analysis took place. The stranded debt was, I think the last of the stranded debt was paid in 2018, 19. And so I'm focusing on the period from 2009 to 2022. So by 2022, there is no more stranded debt.
And this was basically the extra cost or debt that the Hydro One operator had that couldn't be covered by privatization, sale of assets.
Right. And the stranded debt has always been a red herring, Al. It's being used by people who don't know accounting very well, and who are trying to attribute things that are unattributable. And so I've always considered the stranded debt issue as a red herring. And certainly the market surveillance panel doesn't consider it at all. And so, I call BS. And so, again, I didn't have to deal with the stranded debt issue. This is an accounting issue, right?
Yeah.
It's you basically track the numbers that are provided by the government, and you present them in a specific way, and you analyze the numbers in a specific way. But I didn't come up with the numbers.
Yeah.
The
No, I
numbers
understand.
are the official numbers.
So just let me dig in a little bit more on this. So, the wind resources were being built during the period of this analysis from 2009 onwards. Does that temporarily increase their cost impact? Because I know the nuclear resources are currently undergoing refurbishments in most of our major generating facilities, and that's going to increase the cost of electricity in future years. I think there's like a 15-year bump in the nuclear cost that's going to pay for the refurbishments, for example.
Right.
So can you comment on the impacts of those things?
No. This study doesn't look at that. So what it does is, in the first analysis, it in the first section, it takes this data from the market surveillance panel. That is the first time that, from an official source in Ontario, that we see granular level cost data from a time series perspective since 2015, right? So part of the reason that there is so much noise around the signal was because the government had made a decision that after 2015, they would not release the cost data. I am part of the rationale for this, Al, that I wanted to include it, even though it wasn't the main. Put it this way: it's not the main objective for me writing a 10,000 word paper. This could be done in a 2-page pamphlet. But the reason I wanted to include it was to bring to people's attention that this exists, and that it puts to rest many of the superfluous, ambiguous arguments about what costs are and what costs are not, including this red herring of the stranded costs. And so I think that's my main motivation, is to highlight that this data exists, and be the first analyst to actually work with data to tease out what I consider to be the main, the salient points and the policy prescriptions from that. So that's what I'm doing in that first part. But again, it's not my data.
This is great.
It's the government data.
So one other point that I want to make on costs is that many people would say that having non-demand sources, like renewable sources that come on, randomly with respect to load requirements, is that they impact the cost of the rest of the electrical system. If you have a baseload generator that's sized to your system, and you start throwing peaks into it and asking the baseload generator to turn their system off, and they have a fixed cost, that increases their cost of operation. How does the Ontario grid manage these interruptions? Who pays for the who is forced to pay for this? Is it a cost that's added onto nuclear, or is it a cost that's taken out of the thing and given to no one?
Well, that's part of what I was doing. So let me bring you in to, and your listeners and viewers. Let me bring you into the core of the argument, or the core of the piece, the value add, and what basically took about 75-80% of the work. The other part was relatively easy. And it's to answer a different question, right? So, so the political defeat of the Green Energy Act was so absolute that no one, even defenders of the Green Energy Act back in the day, environmental defense, for example, Greenpeace, do not support the Green Energy Act now. Like, so there are no, it's the old, how many, the fathers versus no one likes the failure. No one wants to be associated with the failure. And so, and part of the reason is too, first of all, we all recognize now that local communities have to have a right to, or have a say in siting. Okay. Mm-hmm. Second of all, everyone recognizes that the manner in which wind and solar was rolled out in Ontario was a policy mistake that should never be repeated again. And that policy mistake was the following. The policy mistake was that instead of having an auction competitive system to procure wind, which is one way of doing it, what Ontario did, following Germany, following Spain, following Australia, was to have a feed-in tariff, right? And a feed-in tariff is this. It's a type of contractual arrangement which says this: we're going to have a standing offer. Standing offer. You're not going to have to apply. It's a standing offer. Come and get it. And we're going to have a standing offer whereby we're going to guarantee a set amount that is not established through competition. It's established administratively by the ministry. Mm-hmm. And that set amount, we're going to guarantee that once you come in with a wind project, you're guaranteed that amount. You don't have to bid. It is what it is. And we're going to guarantee that amount for not 5, not 10, but 20 years. Okay? That is the FIT amount. That is the feed-in tariff. And so we did that through the Green Energy Act. And we guaranteed those prices. And so we are now continuing to live through and experiencing and paying, Al, those prices that were set in 2009. And we will be doing that until 2029. And those prices that were set in 2015, we're going to be paying till 2035. And so everyone talks about wind going down in price, but our costs in Ontario for the 20 to 23 period averaged $151 per megawatt hour. So it doesn't matter what your levelized cost of energy says.
Before you move on, let's just put that in context. $151 per megawatt hour is what Ontarians pay for their wind energy.
Correct.
What is the going market rate for wind energy?
Well, it depends on who you believe, but probably in the range of, I came up with a range of about 80.
So roughly twice. We're paying twice the market rate right now.
Market, quote unquote. We'll get into what that market means, but it's double. And we will be paying double. Regardless of what happens with the market, we will be paying double for another 10 years, 15 years. And so what was the rationale at the time? And we have to talk about the rationale to be fair. I mean, we're critiquing post facto. The rationale was, in 2019, this is a new industry. We need to incentivize entry, and we need to, for it to be bankable, we need to be able to de-risk it. And so how do we de-risk entry? We guarantee prices and volumes for 50 years. And so we were able to attract, we were a world leader. We were like a provincial leader in Canada as a result of this, because we had extremely attractive entry conditions to attract this. And believe it or not, the economics worked. If you have very attractive subsidized prices that are designed to meet a specific objective, you're going to be successful. But we're still paying the legacy for that. And contract design was bad. People should have been fired. The contract design basically says that it doesn't matter what market price is doing, Al, we're going to have an escalator clause that actually increases prices over time to take into account inflation. No decreases. And so this idea of a guaranteed fit that is now, we're paying 151. So you can see how the more wind you add to the grid at $151 per megawatt hour, your costs are going to skyrocket in the overall grid as your generation proportion of wind goes from 1% to 10%, right? It's mathematical, right?
Right. So the more you have, the more you're losing.
The more you have, the more it's going to cost you. And not only that, but remember, the average price of generation is around, depending on the year, it's about $90 or $95. So if your average is $90 or $95 and you're adding increasingly more at 151, the more you add, the more that average is going to go up. And that's essentially what happened.
Sure, that makes sense. And just as an add-on, I know that solar panels on Ontario had an even worse fit.
Correct.
And I know you didn't analyze it, but I think the cost of solar is 3 times the cost of wind in the fit.
Yeah, it's in the range of $450 to $500 per megawatt hour.
And since then, solar has really dropped in
but
cost.
It hasn't in our so it hasn't on our bills, right? It hasn't in Ontario bills, right?
But it's a relatively minor contribution compared to wind, right?
Yeah. So that's the political defeat, both the price side and its effect on retail prices, and then the shoving it down people's throats that we saw this defeat. But the defeat was a defeat of a program and a repeal of a program. It wasn't a defeat of the idea of wind generation. That still lives on, as you and I know. And people are trying to get pushed. So while no one defends the GEA, people are still defending wind, right? And so my second component of this work is to say, okay, let's not look at the GEA. Let's look at what is the actual value of wind on the grid, regardless of GEA.
Yes.
And
so
what could
it's costly, but maybe it's lowering carbon emissions.
Correct.
And carbon emissions come with a cost.
That's right.
How do you quantify the value of avoided carbon dioxide emissions by providing wind energy in Ontario?
That's exactly what it is. And it's not only for now, 2020 to 2023, but also in the future, because this is a policy discussion that we're going to be having in Ontario, and many countries are going to have it in Ontario. Like many other countries are going to have is, what's the value of nuclear, right? So the first thing to realize is that the value of nuclear, or the value of wind, is just from a logical perspective, is going to be driven by 2 components. It's going to be driven by the grid that we have, not the wind that we could have, the wind that we have, the grid that we have. And it's going to depend on how strong the wind blows in your geographic area.
Right.
And not only that, but over time, not just like one day, but over the year. So that's what I did. What I did is I went to the ISO, and they have information by hour for every single generation source. And I pulled down, I want to say 20,000, 30,000 data points. And I analyzed from 2020 to 2023, looking for, amongst all of that, using regression analysis, statistical analysis, to look at 4 or 5 different parameters, estimates, right? And the first parameter that I looked at is, if the wind that exists in Ontario blows and generates 1 megawatt hour of wind,
Mhm.
what does that do to the rest of the grid? Right? So it's looking at historical data hourly, by week, for 3 years across all generation sources. So what did I find?
Mhm.
I found this. I found that 1 megawatt of wind displaces 0.56 megawatt hours of gas. Okay?
Okay. I mean, it's an interesting comparison because obviously Ontario doesn't have any coal generation anymore. They shut down the last coal generation plant back around the time the Green Energy Act came out.
Correct. And
So it's not
right.
going to have as big of an impact on the CO2 because coal is taken as the highest
Correct.
CO2 contribution intensity of any fossil fuel burning source.
That's right.
Gas
So
is
that's
about
why I was referring
50% of
what
that,
the
right?
grid's going to do, right? So
Yeah.
what it did is so 0.56
Mhm.
saved fuel, right? Whenever you talk about wind and solar being fuel savers, it displaced 0.56.
Mhm.
It displaced hydro
Mhm.
0.23.
Mhm.
Okay, it contributed 0.17 to net exports,
Okay.
and it had no impact on nuclear.
Okay.
Okay,
So 17% of all our wind was exported,
of the incremental,
and that
yeah,
makes sense because it's not coming on when we need it necessarily. It just
correct.
comes on, and if we have it, we either tell it to curtail or we sell it for pennies on the dollar to the U.S.
That's right. So what happens when we are in what they call a surplus baseload generation process, a situation? First thing we do is we try to export at whatever price it is, because I mean, in a sense, Al, exporting at anything above zero is better than zero,
Curtailing.
right?
Yeah.
It's curtailed.
Or shutting down hydro.
Or shutting down. That's
most
exactly
of this is something that's important for Ontario. Most of our hydro is called run of the river
right.
hydro, and we can't store it. If we don't use it, it goes around the dam and we lose it.
That's right. And so then the second thing we do is we do that. We spill what they call on hydro.
Mhm.
And then we curtail wind. And then we may ask Bruce to shut down or partially shut down to do what they call a nuclear maneuver, which reduces the output of Bruce, because it was designed that way. And so that's the first important estimate,
Mhm.
right? And what I also do is I compare to past studies, right?
Mhm.
Is it high? Is it low? And I also convert it into, as you suggested, in terms of GHG emissions and CO2 emissions.
CO2
And so,
value.
yeah. And so what I was able to calculate was that in Ontario, each megawatt hour of wind avoids 0.227 tons of carbon dioxide.
Okay.
That doesn't mean anything to anyone unless they've looked at the literature, but it is literally a half to a third of comparable numbers in the United States. That shouldn't surprise us because, first of all, we have a very clean grid to begin with. We have no coal. So when we are displacing any emission generation, it's gas, which has relatively low, and we only displace 56% of it. Everything else goes to displacement or export. So the value of wind is relatively low in Ontario because, one, we have a clean grid already. Two, the displacement is only of gas. And three, it displaces hydro, which is already cheap and zero emission, and exports at a loss. And it is therefore lower than in other comparable jurisdictions that I was able to get data on in the US.
So this isn't necessarily a general result. The wind would have more value in places where there's coal or they have very dirty grids, like Germany, for example.
Correct. So that's why the benefit. That's why I call it that. It's the case of Ontario,
Yep.
and it would be the case. It would be the case, for example, of France.
Mhm.
It would be the case of Slovakia. It would be the case of, for example, Denmark, not Denmark, but say Sweden, or any other situation where you're nuclear and run of river, right? Because you wouldn't be able to save anything. It also is specific to Ontario because of the nature of our wind profile, right? Our wind profile is not good. It's one of the poorest in North America. We don't have much wind here. I mean, today, when it's 32 Celsius, where we could really use a lot of wind, and there's no wind.
Right.
The capacity factors of wind in August in Ontario are like below 9%, right? The capacity factor being the ratio of actual generation versus theoretical generation, 10%. And so it's just not blowing. So in Ontario, when we could most use wind, from a climatic perspective, there is no wind. We have a wind drought. It's called wind drought, and it's
what. So what? Let's get to the good here. Like, what was your cost benefit analysis? What was the result when you tried to calculate the benefits?
Right. So anyway, so I get these point estimates of displacement. I then have to go through and provide a dollar amount, right? And so on the cost side, there are two components. There is the wind that we produce that we have to pay at $151 per megawatt hour. There is curtailed wind that we have to pay for because the contracts require us to pay for curtailed wind, even though none of it is generating, right? And so remember I talked to you about that the guarantee contract price is both on volume and price. So the price is the guaranteed 151. The volume is that anytime that you're willing to provide wind, we will pay you that, regardless of whether or not we use it. Okay? That's the volume guarantee, right? So on both sides, Al is shaking his head. So on the cost side, you have wind produced, wind curtailed, both of them multiplied by 151. On the benefit side, you have three things. One is you have the gas generation saved, right? The hydro generation saved that you normally do. You have the additional price, the additional revenues from exports, and you have a value associated with the emissions avoided. All right, and so that value we included in a sensitivity analysis, but that value is called the social cost of carbon, and so that's a value that economists have dreamed up. And it's a value generally between 0 and 100. It's not the same as the federal carbon price, which is about 80, but it is sort of meant to be somewhat similar, right? So it's around, depending on who you believe, it's somewhere between 50, 80, 100, that kind of ballpark.
Dollars per ton.
And so you do all of this analysis and you put it all together. And what I did was that for the 2020 to 2023 period, my net cost benefit analysis was $124 per megawatt hour of wind. So every wind, from a societal perspective, every megawatt of hour wind generated cost us, from a societal perspective, $124. It was a net loss.
Wow.
Okay.
Out of a total cost of 151?
Correct. So the net benefit was modest. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, it's generous of you to give them the benefit of the reduced hydro, because that's just lost money, right? That doesn't really reduce the cost of having dams, does it?
Correct. It is. I want it to be. You're right. I want it to be conservative and or generous, depending on how you look at it. You want to be able to include everything in the benefits. Now, I could have included, the health benefits associated with reduced emissions, like the direct benefits, the health benefit, but it wouldn't have changed that, and that's a different study.
Mm-hmm.
But I want it to be as comprehensive as possible, right? So in the time we have left, what I also did is I said, okay, fine. That is spilt milk, right? That is done, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then the interesting policy discussion, because it's going to come, Al, is, oh, no, we're not going to do that. Wind is actually valuable and the price is going down. So what I did is the following. I said, let's assume that from a societal perspective, our objective is to have a zero cost benefit. Right? So instead of minus 124, let's set it at 0.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to backward engineer the price that wind would have to be in 2027 to 2030 in order for that cost benefit to be 0. Right?
Okay.
So it's called the break even. Right? Like, what's the break-even price? Like, it's like any decision that we all have to take. At what point do what is my break-even price?
Mm-hmm.
And the break-even price that I calculated for the year 2027, looking at all of these elements, right,
Mm-hmm.
was, and I want to make sure I get this right, was $46 per megawatt hour of wind in 2027 to 2030 is the dollar amount from a societal perspective
Mm-hmm.
that wind breaks even to be valuable in today's grid, not in a grid that could be in the future, not in the grid that we're doing modeling, but in today's grid in 2027, 2030 is 46. And then the question is, would anyone be interested from the private sector to provide wind at that price?
Mm-hmm. Knowing that they're not getting, you'd have to have some sort of a payback for the carbon credits that you're generating as well.
There'd have to be all kinds of scenarios, but what is my takeaway? My takeaway is to policymakers, ministries, is if you're thinking of wind and you're thinking about that, you still consider it valuable for societal, political reasons, and you want to have it in, what should you pay for it? You should not pay for more than $46 per megawatt hour. That's the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Anything above that, you are contributing to a net societal loss.
Wow. Okay, that's very strong conclusion, and I think very important to get out there for legislatures and to spread the word. So really good work. Is there anything else you'd like to add on that you've come across, or any advice that you'd like to give? I mean, obviously the advice, we don't build wind.
No, it's not that we don't build wind. It's that we learned the lessons of the GAA that you don't build wind at any price, that
Mm-hmm.
everything has a price and everything has a cost.
Yeah.
And so we have to because, as you know, Al, there are many people
Mm-hmm.
who want wind because it's wind, right? Regardless of the price.
Yes,
right?
And so how we got here.
Right. And this, and a lot of people who don't look at the price of wind would like you to focus on the price of nuclear. So there's a classic, cognitive dissonance. And so one of my things I wanted to do is I wanted to put a price on wind. And it's not that I'm against wind. or I'm for it, is that in the grid that we have in Ontario, it has a value. It has a societal value that we take into account, for example, including, the climate benefits. And if we want to match public costs and public benefit, we have to take into account what that value is. And overpaying for it doesn't make sense in wind or anything else.
And from what you had said, right, there are jurisdictions or geographical locations where wind is 2 to 3 times more valuable than in Ontario.
Correct.
And at that point, you're getting close to the actual cost of wind generation, or even exceeding it.
Perhaps. Exactly. So, imagine, a country, I don't know, like South Africa, Poland, Australia, that is, 80%, 70% coal, right? Like if you could, and so you would say, okay, well, if you put it in a wind turbine, it's going to do 2 things. First of all, maybe it's going to blow better than Ontario. That's one thing. That's another issue. But even if it doesn't blow that much, that 1 megawatt of hour is likely to displace maybe 0.9 megawatt hours of coal. And, given how emissions intensive coal is compared to gas, the value of that could be 3 or 4 times that of Ontario. And so in that situation, a higher price of wind could even be justified. But I don't know. That's a different study in a different grid under a different wind profile.
Well, that's very good. And so I think we're getting towards the end of our time slot here. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing this scoop with the Rational View. Listeners out there, you are the first ones to know about this. So thank you so much, Edgardo. I really appreciate it every time you come on. You've always got interesting things to say.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Al. It was great to catch up. Third Rational View. So again, next time I have another scoop, I will come to you and see what we can talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Bye, Al.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.